My name is Ada Skiles, and I'm the Associate Director of Chapin Hall at the University of Chicago. On behalf of Chapin Hall, I would like to welcome you to our Child and Family Policy Forum. We would like to thank those of you who are here in person and those joining us with our live webcast for taking the time to be with us today. Today's program is entitled At-Scale Implementation of Evidence-Based Interventions, Policy, Practice, and Evaluation Perspectives. I know you will find today's program both lively and informative. Moderating our panel of experts on this topic is Claire Anderson, a policy fellow at Chapin Hall. Again, thank you very much for participating with us today. I will now turn the program over to Claire, who will introduce our panel to you.
Thanks so much, Ada. I'd like to offer a warm welcome to you this morning. Thank you for joining us here in person and remotely online. We'll be talking about, as Ada indicated, the at-scale implementation of evidence-based interventions from the perspectives of policy, practice, and evaluation. We think that conceptually, this discussion naturally is an extension of our last forum, which focused on promoting the well-being of children. Today, we hope to move from the broader well-being framework towards more specificity about the implementation of evidence-based interventions to yield positive well-being outcomes for children. In our discussion today, we'll talk about using foster, kinship, and birth parents as the deliverer of the intervention rather than clinicians, which pushes us to think about the unique role caregivers play in supporting children who have experienced adversity and trauma. We do believe that it is highly possible to shift from a generic set of services in child welfare to an approach that relies heavily on the science and the research about what works. We'll explore the complexities of scaling up evidence-based interventions from these three perspectives: policy, practice, and evaluation. To help us do that, we're joined by three pretty terrific panelists today. To offer the policy perspective, we have Brian Samuels, who is the Executive Director of Chapin Hall and was, until about 6 months or so ago, the Commissioner at the Administration on Children, Youth, and Families at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, where he was responsible for setting the policy direction in the federal child welfare arena. On the practice front, we have Patty Chamberlain, who is a research scientist at the Oregon Social Learning Center. She'll discuss her work in developing and implementing large-scale evidence-based interventions, including keeping foster parents and kinship parents supported, which is commonly referred to as KEEP, and parenting through change. Fred Wolshin, a senior research fellow at Chapin Hall, will round out our discussion about evaluations that can identify the positive effects of evidence-based interventions in the context of taking these interventions to scale outside of the academic research environment. While the use of evidence-based interventions is not currently the norm in child welfare, today's discussion, we hope, will really offer a glimpse into what is possible. I'll now ask Brian to provide an overview of the policy context in which evidence-based interventions are being deployed in child welfare before we have Patty Chamberlain offer information about scaling up evidence-based interventions. Thank you.
Good morning also. There's a real value in having the conversation that started in our last session and now a much more targeted approach here. And the nature of the conversation is such that Today, we know from a policy standpoint, particularly in child welfare, that there is a growing body of literature around how to intervene and how to intervene effectively. Child welfare has for a very long time been built on the need to intervene in order to protect children and to keep them safe. Child welfare has also taken on the responsibility of also ensuring permanent solutions, permanent families for all children who have been a part of the child welfare system. Today, however, we know that while those two steps are critically important to the long-term well-being of children, so is effectively intervening on the social and emotional challenges that come both with abuse and neglect, as well as being removed from one's biological family. But I think it's safe to say today that when you look across all of the science and align them, it is clear to us that child welfare can and should take an integrated approach to promoting safety, permanency, and well-being. And again, I think we stand on solid ground in saying that each of those components are critical to the positive outcomes long-term, but no single one of them is likely to be sufficient to produce the kind of outcomes we want for vulnerable children and their families. So we have, over the last 5 years as a field, really attempted to articulate in child welfare how to think about an integration of safety, permanency, and well-being around the 4 key domains that children have for success. So we think about promoting well-being as having an impact on the cognitive functioning of children in a positive way, having an impact on the physical and health and developmental capacity for children and youth, addressing the social and emotional functioning for youth, and social functioning. We think all of these pieces together become a critical part of the way in which we promote healthy functioning across those key domains of life so that youth can navigate their lives, their everyday lives, in an effective manner. The challenge has often been in child welfare that folks thought that we couldn't define what well-being looked like. We couldn't define what the developmental challenges were as a cause of abuse and neglect that might prevent positive outcomes. This is one framework that takes each of the age groups and tries to articulate in each of the key domains that I just indicated the critical skills that children need at each age level in order to successfully make progress in their regular lives and ultimately maturing into adulthood. And so we know developmentally that we can articulate what the competencies need to be, and therefore we're in a much better position to promote building that capacity for children through intervening in child welfare in a developmentally focused and well-being designed approach. And so the field of child welfare has really taken on this challenge of moving to an integrated approach. There are states, counties, and localities across the country that are working to bring these pieces together in a way that really will promote better outcomes for children and increase the likelihood that they will return home and succeed while they're at home. And when there's the misfortune of a termination of parental rights, really intervening in a way that increases the likelihood that they will succeed with their adoptive placement or in a guardianship placement. So we've articulated the essential elements of moving child welfare to a well-being framework as follows. A focus on both child and family level outcomes rather than just systems outcomes. Being able to monitor progress over time so that we know that children are actually getting better while they're in our care. Third, to be proactive around the social and emotional needs. We know the traumatic experiences that children in foster care have before they enter the system. We also know the trauma that they often experience while they're in the system. And I can assure you, as they exit the system, those are also very challenging times. And we need to be proactive and be able to anticipate meeting those needs so that children don't have to struggle before they receive the help that they need, and they don't have to struggle in a manner that gets in the way of their body being able to focus on building the kind of capacity they need to succeed. We also think that it's an essential element to be able to be developmentally specific about the way in which we intervene. Promoting healthy relationships, which are critical and an important aspect of the impact that trauma has on children, is often attachment issues and the challenges of really relating to adults in positive ways. And the sixth essential element is really building the capacity to deliver more intensive interventions that are sophisticated enough to respond to the meaningful challenges that children bring with them when they come into contact with the child welfare system. And so what's really cool about this presentation is I'm really going to hand off this work to Patty Chamberlain, who will describe both the body of her work, but particularly an intervention that she has introduced in a number of child welfare systems. And I think what's really cool about her work is it really does move child welfare in each of these domains and moves child welfare into building the kind of essential practice that's necessary to promote positive outcomes. So I will get out of the way and let Patty come and tell you about the really important work that she's done and the way in which it fits well in a well-being context.
Thank you, Brian, for that nice introduction. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the interventions that we've developed and how we have fit them into the child welfare, various child welfare systems. First, I just want to talk a bit about the body of research that is available to us on how parents can be strengthened to improve the well-being of their children. There is a great deal of consensus about what it takes to perform effective parenting. And there's been a great deal of research on strengthening parents and helping parents provide optimal situations to reinforce the development of their children. And the research has been actually hundreds of randomized control trials for a number of different models support the idea that there are common features in parenting that need to be built and strengthened. And those include providing nurturance and care, good supervision, limit setting and control when necessary, teaching, advice, mentoring, and supporting behaviors that support effective adaptation to developmentally relevant demands. And of course, these shift over the life course of children, and also discouraging behaviors that hinder positive adaptation. So what's neat about the research base, I think, is that you have a number of different investigators across the US and in Europe who have come to very, very similar conclusions about what it takes to identify and promote effective parenting. And there have been a number of meta-analyses that really document these similarities, and a number of interventions that have been developed across developmental periods that show long-term outcomes that happen much later than the intervention was actually experienced by the children and families, so that these interventions have showed cascading positive effects over time. So the idea is that if you can sort of bump the trajectory of positive parenting, effective parenting, it's going to have long-term effects on child well-being. And I'm just here showing a number of the diverse positive effects that have been documented in these randomized control trials. And as you can see, they really are crossing the developmental lifespan of from early childhood, even prenatal, early childhood through middle childhood, through adolescence and into young adulthood. So we find that there is this body of well-being outcomes that have been well documented as a result of the intervention being on trying to improve parenting. We at Oregon Social Learning Center have built our interventions mostly around trying to strengthen parenting. And what you find is that these parenting interventions, and we ourselves started out doing preventive interventions, doing interventions that could be used in mental health contexts, in juvenile justice contexts, but rarely do you see these interventions implemented in child welfare contexts. And when you do see them implemented in child welfare contexts, they're sort of niche interventions. It might be a little thing that's happening here, but it really isn't something that is integrated into the practice culture in child welfare. And they tend to be sort of isolated, and they have not really taken on the important area of, can we think about a different way that caseworkers who have the most daily or weekly or monthly contact with parents, both foster and biological, can we change the way that they think about and that they interact with parents, be they foster, adoptive, biological, relatives, whoever those caregivers are going to be? Can we think about the way, can we work on changing the way that caseworkers conceptualize their relationship and their opportunity to strengthen the parenting of this diverse group of parents? So I want to talk about a case example that we've been involved in most recently. This was a system-initiated attempt to make a difference in how casework was developed to parents at all levels for kids placed in foster care, for kids and their family placed in foster care. And the idea here was that we would link three interventions to really try to cover the ground of changing the quality of service that parents got and the way that caseworkers interacted with parents. And so you really change essentially the role of the caseworker from someone who's monitoring your progress to someone who's responsible for helping you make that progress. And that's actually a major shift. So I show this example because it's the only example that I've been involved in where the scope is that large. I've been involved in several implementations of interventions in child welfare systems, but it has been with this intervention, with KEEP or with multidimensional treatment foster care. But I've been involved in a continuum of interventions in the juvenile justice system, but never in child welfare. Okay, so KEEP. I want to talk a little bit about KEEP and the background of KEEP. We have conducted 4 randomized controlled trials on KEEP, and then we've implemented KEEP as a solo, standalone intervention in several places in the U.S. and in Europe. What the randomized controlled trials found about KEEP is that having parents participate in KEEP, and I believe the people in the room have a handout that describes what exactly is involved in KEEP. It's a group intervention for foster parents that takes place over 16 weeks and is designed to strengthen and give them practice on using effective parenting techniques. Compared to foster families who did not receive KEEP in these randomized controlled trials, we found fewer placement disruptions for the kids placed in their home. And interestingly, the effect was strongest for kids who had had 3 previous placement disruptions. So those are the kids who have a much higher risk of having another placement disruption. We found also that the children had fewer foster parent reported child behavioral and emotional problems, and that they were more reunified with their family more quickly. When we did a mediation analysis that looked at what was the driver of the intervention effects, we found that foster and kin parents used more positive reinforcement on a daily basis with the kids in their home. And they used discipline less frequently than the control groups, and the discipline was less escalated. So it was quick, non-harsh, and then they'd get back to positively reinforcing the kid. Parenting through change is a well-established intervention that has had long-term outcomes as long as 9 years post-intervention, showing improvements in parenting, children's externalizing and internalizing behavior, maternal depression, and reduced outcomes that are reported by teachers, official delinquency and police records, and so on. So a diverse array of positive outcomes. And then in order to take these interventions and really infuse them into daily practice, we developed a practice model, the beginnings of a practice model, I think I could call this, called R3, where we are supporting caseworkers and supervisors in every contact that they have with foster, bio, adoptive, relative parents to reinforce the parent's effort, to reinforce the parent's relationship with their child, and to reinforce identify and reinforce the next small step that parent needs to take to either help that child make a better adjustment or to further their case plan. And this was our way of trying to bring the principles that were in these two linked interventions down into the daily practice of caseworkers. In order to see how these interventions are actually being delivered on a daily kind of basis, you need to figure out a way to support the fidelity of these. So what we were able to do with advances in technology is have all of the group sessions in KEEP and Parenting Through Change uploaded onto a laptop computer, sent securely over the network to consultants in Oregon. We then watched those tapes, rated the fidelity of those tapes, and then we consulted with the facilitators, the caseworkers who were running those groups, and the supervisors who were implementing the R3 intervention with their caseworkers. And so that gave us a very nice view of how to not only help deal with the complex problems and collaborate with the caseworkers and supervisors, but really to understand how well the interventions were being delivered. So, by way of a couple of ending comments, when we did the implementation in New York, as you can imagine, when you tell a group of caseworkers, the whole sort of idea about how you do your job, we're going to try to change that. We're going to try to, rethink what your relationship is with parents. Some of the caseworkers embraced it pretty enthusiastically, and others were pretty wary at the beginning. And some people said things like, "This is what I went to social work school for," and other people said, "There's no way I'm getting up in front of a group and doing this." But over time, we saw quite a bit of change in the relationships, and we were able to look at these, and because we're looking at fidelity. And basically, there was a shift. Caseworkers were saying, parents don't see us as villains anymore. We're on their side. And they're able to have a very good view of what kind of progress that parent is making because they're the ones delivering the service. They're not having to find out from this therapist or that therapist or this parenting class person. They're the ones who are front and center. Implementation, we learned, and we've learned this over and over again, the most important piece of implementation is to develop a partnership and a collaboration with the agencies that you're working with, because you're trying to fit a new set of practices and procedures into an existing culture. And you need to set this up so that you're not tone deaf to that culture and that you're collaborating on how you're going to intertwine this new practice idea into the culture that already exists. And I think finally, just to say that implementation takes perseverance. It's always a work in progress. And if we can use data, fidelity data, and other kinds of data to continually refine and improve that implementation, I think we're on the right track. Okay, thank you.
Good morning. I'm going to be talking this morning with you about the challenges of evaluating these so-called at-scale implementations of evidence-based interventions or practices. Excuse me, I want to cover a couple of things. First of all, it's the issue of what exactly does at-scale mean from an evaluation perspective, and in particular, the obvious challenge is where do you get the counterfactual? Who are you going to compare the results of your implementation with in order to establish whether or not things actually moved in the right direction? Second topic I want to talk about is the notion of the laboratory versus the real world. I think everybody gets that tension. The fact that we're not doing this on 50 or 60, 70 kids in a randomized trial, but they were actually out there in the real world scaling up. That's the main difference. But I want to talk specifically about the issue of system effects. The fact that there are countervailing forces that don't exist in the hothouse of a laboratory experiment that really have an effect on what happens. And then the two main points of my conversation really are about service before the sale. Like, what are you going to do before you decide on implementing or bringing to scale an evidence-based intervention? And then service after the sale. And in particular, the integration of evaluation with CQI. I think that that's really where the future of this ultimately lands. So at scale and the problem of system effects, what we're really talking here about at scale are things that you can measure at the public health level. That in the big reports that government produces at the end of the year, we're able to actually talk about a change in how long kids stay in out-of-home care. We can actually talk about the reduction in placement instability, there's less reentry, there's better well-being as either a direct or a mediated effect as a result of the interventions. But we're talking about these at a grand scale, thousands of kids. In the Illinois child welfare system, we want to move the needle for 19,000 kids, not 50 kids. And there, of course, is the issue of the counterfactual. So if we're measuring the system against itself, where do we find the other data with which to compare? And I think that I'll cover that off a little bit in the CQI notion, because it really is about ultimately comparing myself against to what my best guess as to what I think I would have done but for the scale up of the evidence-based intervention. The most important thing here, I think, are system effects and the system structures that operate for and against evidence-based interventions. And I think it's less of a case in Illinois, perhaps because of the performance-based contracting, in other jurisdictions where they still rely on fee-for-services for delivering of placement services. The issue of if I implement an evidence-based intervention at scale, and I shorten length of stay, I reduce placement instability, it has effects on the system. And those, one of the effects it will happen is the change in the way the money is flowing. And if you're reducing length of stay and you get paid to provide foster care, the implementation of an evidence-based intervention places an organization in harm's way from a fiscal perspective. So the idea that you are operating counter to the organization's interests is, I think, an important problem, and that's simply an example of the kinds of tensions at-scale implementations inevitably introduce. And from an evaluation perspective, we have to be able to conceptualize and then measure what those effects are. Service before the sale, what exactly does that mean? I like to think of this as fixed effects thinking in a variable effects world. What does that mean? Well, it means that when we think about child welfare reform, we think about let's do that for the whole system. Every part of the state, every population of children served. That's what we're going to do. We're going to do this, we're going to do that. We don't really think about the fact that, well, the problems aren't the same everywhere. They're not the same for all the kids in the system. They're not the same for all the organizations in the system, and they're not the same for all the parts of the system, geographically speaking, for example. So we have to get behind the variation in the service delivery through a process that I'll call social valuation. I don't like to have a presentation without a completely interpretable graph, so here I've met my obligation. Imagine, if you will, there are in a jurisdiction roughly 40 providers of out-of-home care, and you'd be tempted to try and reduce length of stay in every one of those provider organizations. And you might implement an evidence-based intervention at scale in each and every one of these organizations. The question is, can you really expect the same benefit from the implementation of the evidence-based intervention from each of these organizations? So the ones we have on the left here are organizations that underperform the system average in a statistically significant way. And to the ones at the right are those that outperform the system average in a statistically significant way. We're looking to change the average from a state perspective at scale. But this graph suggests that investments in evidence-based interventions will play out very differently depending upon which organizations are involved in the scale-up. I might not expect, well, let's put it this way. For the organizations at the left, at the far left, there's plenty of evidence that in that system you can do better. There's actually 38 data points to the right that say you can accomplish more in that system than that one organization is. So that's a different value proposition with regard to that organization. Now, there may be good reasons why they're at that point in the distribution, and it may relate to the likelihood that they'll successfully implement an evidence-based intervention. You want to take that into account. But the big question is, can you expect as much from that organization as compared to the one to the far right, where there are no examples of doing better with regard to that outcome in that jurisdiction? How much more performance improvement can you expect from that organization? And how do those considerations weigh on the choice of what you do, where you do it, and the expectation for at-scale improvement? Which of these organizations is most likely to deliver the change in the average performance for the state as a whole, which is what at-scale means? So here the objective is to improve permanency. Each point represents the relative performance, and it could be of a state, it could be of a county, it could be of a provider, it could be a unit in your organization. The idea is to find the outliers on the high side and the low side of the average and answer the question, where's the best bet? Where are you most likely? And from an evaluation perspective, it's at this point in the process where asking yourselves how to improve the chances of success is a perfectly appropriate question. After the implementation is finished, you've got the outcome data in, that's the wrong time to ask, how can we make this look better? You have lots of opportunity at the beginning, and answering these kinds of questions and managing expectations accordingly is an important task. Service after the sale. I think ultimately, in order to succeed at-scale interventions, we have to bring together what everybody now understands as CQI as a design and evaluation framework. It's not simply for understanding whether or not things are working as intended. It really is about a design and evaluation framework brought together that will help you understand what to do and then whether or not you did what you said you were going to do. We have to conceptualize evidence-based interventions, the kinds of things that Patty was talking about in her presentation, as changes to process quality and capacity. We want to know, what are you supposed to do? So Patty was very clear in the description of KEEP as to there are certain expectations that workers will do certain things differently. That's the what. The quality is the question of, well, how well do you do it? What are the requirements of engaging families? How well do you execute? And then capacity is having the resources to execute at the expected level. The CQI process is going to have you focus on all three of those things as part of the logic model or the theory of change. Fidelity is adherence to process quality and capacity standards. If you say you're going to do something, then you've got to go out and measure whether or not you did it at the quality expected. And you have to make judgments about whether or not the reason for coming up short or exceeding expectations has to do with whether or not you have the appropriate capacity. And then effectiveness ultimately is the relationship between the fidelity and the outcomes. How well did you manage process, quality, and capacity and its relationship to outcomes at the end of the day? I like to make pictures. This just talks a little bit about, but the investments of A, B, and C. And I think we're tempted to see each evidence-based intervention as different. Indeed, they are. But what they all speak to is what's the expectation with regard to process? What's the expectation with regard to capacity? What's the expectation with regard to quality? And they are tied to the development of a theory of change. What are you going to do? What are you asking people to do differently? And the evaluation before and after the process is to ask people to be very clear about what your answers to the question. So the CQI challenge in at-scale implementations as an evaluation problem is really the quality of the CQI analytics. The strength of CQI is its ability to deliver on-time fidelity and outcome measures. Patty talked about the importance of fidelity and outcome data as part of the renewal process. How do you understand how well we're doing? The weakness of CQI, oftentimes, and I would say the majority of times, is the measurement technology and the analytics. Evaluation is very good at high-quality methods, but poor on-time delivery. It's hard to run a system with a typical evaluation strategy. CQI is good on the on-time delivery, but it often lacks the rigorous methodology required to really know what's going on. The remedy is the better integration of evaluation and CQI. The dose response timing is a fidelity problem. Did the subjects of your intervention get what they're supposed to get when they were supposed to get it? When, in fact, did they get it? And how does it factor into what happens next? The nice thing about evaluation is we get to look at all the data and look backwards in time. The problem from a CQI perspective is you've got to look forward in time. You've got to ask the question, how do I change what's going to happen next to this child? And integrating that perspective and the evaluation perspective, I think, in a dose response perspective is very important. The main problem from an analytics perspective on the CQI, from the CQI perspective, is what I would call sampling on the outcome. A lot of people will say, well, I've got a problem with this issue, this outcome. Adoptions take too long. So what I'm going to go do is I'm going to go study kids who got adopted, and I'm going to figure out what went wrong. The problem is that you're selecting on the outcome, and it's hard to understand the process that got you there if you aren't also looking at the people who didn't get the outcome, because you don't really know whether or not they're having exactly the same experiences. So the conclusions you draw from your population of children who were adopted or reunified or who had a recurrent maltreatment episode, if you're only looking at them, you have a narrow view of the universe. And that's the tempting thing in most CQI processes. I want to understand adoption, so I'm going to look at adopted children as the sole source of information about what's taking place. And that's really an analytics problem. That would not be a sufficient sample for understanding the process so that you can bring the process into the CQI process, understand it, develop hypotheses about how to change it, and then implement those hypotheses. And then the last thing I want to bring everybody back to, and again, it's most of these things people understand quite readily, is the role of patience and time horizons. If you have an underlying length of stay that's 18 months in out-of-home care, to change length of stay is going to take much more than 18 months, because you got to worry about the kids who contribute to the average who are in care for 24, 27, 30, 33 months. And until you know whether or not their experience changes, it's hard to know what the impact is. So the time horizons in child welfare reform, CQI, evidence-based intervention scale-up is very long, or potentially very long. And figuring out how to bring in interim information to bear on that process to keep, frankly, the political attention required to build momentum behind evidence-based interventions and their scale-up. Learning how to do that in a CQI context is ultimately, I think, the biggest challenge. Thank you very much.
Fred, thank you so much. We're now going to open the floor for discussion. We have about 45 minutes. We hope to have a really robust give and take with our panelists. And why don't we start with questions from our remote guests. We have one that has come in online. And Patty, I think we'll have you start, and then we'll probably go to Fred for this. In terms of implementation, can you discuss the pros and cons and the tensions between taking advantage of existing capacity, often in large systems, to implement evidence-based practices versus building the capacity of smaller community-based organizations to reinvent themselves, to repurpose themselves by becoming trained as deliverers of evidence-based interventions?
Okay, I'm not sure I completely understand the distinction, but I think that the idea of capitalizing on the existing workforce is a necessary part of scale up. I mean, we're not going to scale up by bringing in new people to do that. I mean, we have, when you think about, and when you think about, for example, foster parents, they're in foster parents, you have probably one of the biggest, one of the largest groups of untapped potential that exists in the child welfare system. I mean, these people are having an incredible influence, for positive or negative, on the kids who are placed in their homes. I mean, we know from research and from common sense that parents play a tremendous role in the development of their children. And I think we pay far too little attention to the potential positive effects, or to at least try to, move the relationships in a positive way that we have, with the existing workforce of foster parents, for example.
Yeah, I think the only thing I'd add, and I think Fred can weigh in, I think the other part about thinking about the untapped capacity of foster parenting is that, today we don't do much work around thinking about the quality of the parenting that occurs in the homes where children are placed. And we rely that the training and licensing process is sufficient to ensure quality foster parenting. But you could imagine that even if it was the best training in the universe, over time, it might lose its effect. And that time horizon might be longer than the requirement to go get relicensed again for foster parenting. So I think it's an untapped resource. It's in part because we've made this assumption that the quality of foster parenting doesn't matter in the outcomes that we want for children and families. And I think that assumption only makes sense if you think more narrowly about the system's desire to maybe just reduce the size and do it in a way that doesn't expose children to harm and bad things happening. But as soon as you get beyond that and you want to talk about actually changing behavior and outcomes for children, it seems to me that the quality of foster parenting becomes directly relevant. And the benefit of a model like KEEP is, rather than trying to change and improve the quality of foster parenting through a training model, where you bring them in and didactically interact with them for a couple of days and then send them back to do foster parenting, it's doing the work in the real context that the foster parents are operating in, and it's building their capacity and monitoring their progress over time in a way that produces the kind of environment where then good outcomes can occur. And so when you look at the foster parenting as an untapped resource for having a positive effect, it does mean that you then have to make an investment in those foster parents in order to get them to the place where they're actually having that value-added impact on the outcomes for children. And so, I mean, that's the fascinating part about KEEP is it does try to tap into that unrealized potential, but do it in a way that is structured and in the environment in which the outcome is likely to occur, so it has the greatest likelihood of changing the outcome for a child.
So I have a slightly different take on the question, I think, and I think it's although it dovetails nicely with what Brian and Patty have said. I think one of the challenges for smaller community-based organizations, it was that phrase I think in the question that keyed my interpretation, is how does a smaller community-based intervention actually organization actually invest in evidence-based interventions and the associated expenses with regard to that effort, and so how do small organizations play in an evidence-based driven world? And I think the key to it gets to the issue of time use and interpreting whether or not you're actually repurposing the time your workforce is already doing, or are you adding something significant? Because the cost of those two scenarios are entirely different from an organizational survival perspective. And so I think there's an analysis that has to be done at the organizational level as to whether or not I'm going to take the 500,000 person hours that my organization currently contributes and add another 250,000 hours, which is a big new expense. Yeah. Or am I going to take the 500,000 hours and figure out how to get those people to do something differently? I think that the answer with regard to the survival of small organizations in this world really depends on how well you craft an answer to that question.
Thank you, Fred. Thank you all. Let's take a question from the audience. Yes, sir.
Yes, I have a question for Patty.
We're getting a microphone to you. If you could just hold on a second. Thank you.
Yes, this question is for Patty. Regarding the Parenting Through Change and the KEEP programs, are parents or foster parents assigned strictly sequentially, or is there a categorical element? For example, first-time mothers separate from second-time mothers, or experienced foster parents with or without the kinship care group?
Yeah, that's it. We have taken sort of a universal approach. That is, nobody's ineligible, and we do not try to, sort of slice and dice the population, except in one way. And that is that we like the parents in the groups to have placed with them developmentally, so if we're going to run a group for young kids, we like to have all the parents have at least one young kid placed with them versus teenagers, because the intervention shifts depending on the developmental level of the child. But in terms, we've experimented around a little bit with this. In terms of including kinship parents and foster parents in the same group, that works quite well. And it's much richer to have a group where you have the whole spectrum of experience of foster parents in that group, rather than just experienced foster parents. Because in both of these interventions, and bio parents, in both of these interventions, there's a lot of group learning that goes on. You can learn, it's much less threatening to learn new skills when you have other 5, 6, 7 people in the room who are in there with you doing that. And they have a wide variety of experiences that are very helpful that they hear from each other. So it's not a classroom didactic sort of an approach. It's let's try this with our kids this next week, and then let's talk about how our kids reacted and how we reacted, and what worked in our homes and what didn't work in our homes. And it's very helpful, I think, for parents to hear from each other their experiences. I think it makes them much richer, and it's good if you have a variety of parenting styles and parents in a group. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
Nancy.
Thank you. I wanted to understand if the foster parents, if the biological families of the foster parents are also receiving this training at the same time, so that their skill building and support systems are being crafted and enabled in anticipation of reunification, or not? Is that by design?
Yeah, you know, I had a little bit of the same question, so I'll just expand on that a little bit. You know, when is the intervention applied? For how long? Is it happening concurrently with the foster parent and the birth parent? So just helping us to understand the overall sequencing and logistics of the intervention would be helpful.
Okay. So the critical timeline for the biological aftercare resource or relative resource or adoptive resource is, you know, we want to establish sort of a set of skills. So the way Parenting Through Change is delivered is it's delivered in 10 sessions. So you get, and that can be any time during the child's placement history. So you get sort of a basic set of skills that you're helping parents to develop and strengths that you're trying to build. And then around the time of reunification, there's another 6 sessions that happen. So that's sort of a refresher and expansion. And ideally, and this, you know, is often hard to pull off logistically, but you'd have 3 of those 6 sessions before the child reunified and the latter 3 at the time, you know, once the child is back in the home. So the timeline is critical for that delivery of the last 6 sessions on Parenting Through Change, but not so critical on the beginning 10. Because remember, what we're trying to do is once the foster parents or the biological parents get the dose of this intervention, now they have presumably a new way of interacting with their kids, because that's what we're going for. Then the R3 intervention comes in there and reinforces that in the daily contact that the caseworker has. So the caseworkers have all been trained in these approaches. They know that this parent had a problem with getting into power struggles with their youngster. They learned the skills of doing that when they went in the group, and now they're trying to reinforce those lessons over and over again. So the timing is not so critical. Whether KEEP and PTC happen at the same time is not important. KEEP, there's actually been a new study that's just in press right now that shows that participating in KEEP, we ask foster parents to focus on their most challenging kid. So maybe they have 3 children placed in the home, and they'll pick the child that they want to kind of focus on and keep. So, but what we were always hoping, and we now have some documentation that shows, is that it would have effects on the other kids in the home as well, because it's a parenting intervention. So, presumably, you change parenting, you have sort of a ripple effect, not only on the child that you focus on, but in the other children placed there. So KEEP, the way we do that in terms of timing, I think probably as a practical matter, the sooner you get foster parents in their career of providing foster care, that would make sense to have it ideally delivered then. And then every year we do a booster, so sort of a 10-session version of KEEP that just kind of refreshes and talks about how the strategies have been employed with subsequent kids that have been placed in the home.
I think an important aspect of the question, as well as the answer, is that early on in the field of child welfare, folks became concerned that if we added a perspective around well-being, we would necessarily add to the length of time a child spent in out-of-home care.
That was the worry.
Right. And so, as you heard through Patty's description, we're not talking years here. We're talking weeks. So, KEEP is an example of an intervention that can be done in a fairly short period of time, and it has longer-term benefits. So integrating such an approach in a child welfare system doesn't increase the likelihood that the child needs to spend more time in care in order to get the sufficient dosage. And in fact, what Patty's data shows is that when KEEP is introduced, children actually experience shorter lengths of stay, not longer ones. And so there's a really important part of the underlying question that Patty's work speaks to, which is this concern that the approach might extend the length of care. And so by integrating, you're thinking about this model as really integrating, creating safety and permanency, but also doing it in the context of well-being. In this instance, it actually produces a shorter length of stay, fewer placement disruptions, and less problem behavior. So bonus, 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 right? And so I think that's the benefit here, and it's done, as I indicated, in weeks, not years.
Great. Thank you both so much. Fred, now that we've had a little bit of a overview of the logistics and the concrete aspects of the intervention, can you talk a little bit about how you designed the evaluation to address some of the conceptual or theoretical problems that you identified in your presentation?
So this is a little bit of inside baseball, but it's an important issue. So one of the nice things about KEEP is that it has very good fidelity data collection. Patty talked about it a little bit earlier. But what it allowed us to do from an evaluation perspective was understand exactly when the treatment was administered. When were the kids, by virtue of their placement in a home where the foster parent received KEEP training, when did that happen in the placement history of that child? Did it happen in the first month? Did it happen in the fourth month? Did it happen in the 12th month? And then we could understand how many sessions. So was there complete delivery of the treatment? Did they only get a certain portion of the incomplete train up of the foster parents? And then again, time all of that with respect to the child's history of being in foster care. So we were able to ask the question, not length of stay, did it shorten, but from the time the treatment was administered, did placement duration change? So that ability to target our assessment of the onset of treatment, the duration of treatment, the completeness of treatment relative to what happens next, the question I posed at the beginning, turned out to be, I think, a very powerful way to talk about. The second thing that we had to do, so it was at scale in New York. Well, we did have a counterfactual that consisted of agencies that were not in the KEEP demonstration or the KEEP component of the system, but we also had years and years and years worth of data going back in time. So we were able to compare basically three populations. The kids served by the KEEP agencies during the time KEEP was in place. So we flip a switch on and we say KEEP is operational in that agency from that point forward. Then there were the non-KEEP agencies operating at exactly the same time. And then there were the kids in non-KEEP agencies and KEEP agencies who served children prior to what could have possibly been exposure to the KEEP intervention. So we have about 10 years worth of data to track what's going on in the first year of the KEEP implementation. So we don't have a control group in the classic randomized clinical trial sense of the word, but we've got everything else that's happening in the system simultaneously and historically to understand exactly what was happening to the kids in the KEEP and PTC R3 intervention. So I think, and this will be a major problem for government in particular, is that they're not running social experiments. Except for the opinion of intentionally. And so you have this problem of, okay, you got great results from an RCT, but how do you actually monitor whether or not things get better? And our ability to time with good fidelity measurement, which is something you get not as a result of the evaluation, but as a byproduct of your management of the intervention. That's the important thing here. This is not added on. This is how you make the intervention work and improve the intervention over time. We take that very same data and use it to understand at system scale whether or not we're actually bending the curve that describes how much foster care kids get in a particular setting. So I think it'll help solve a lot of problems, but it really is dependent upon how well the fidelity issues are addressed in the design of the intervention and in your execution of the intervention.
Great. Thank you. Let's take another question from the floor here in the room, and while we're getting the microphone to this gentleman in the middle, I'm going to remind our guests who are joining us remotely that they can send in questions to the following email address, policyforum@chapinhall.org. So we'd love to get your voice into the conversation as well. That email address again is policyforum@chapinhall.org. Yes, sir.
This is really, really interesting. Question for Patty. How did you pick the fidelity model that you used, so the video feedback? How did you come up with that model? Did you experiment with alternative approaches to doing that? And who paid for it?
Yeah. So we wanted to base our fidelity monitoring / support on observation, as opposed to on self-report. Because if you've ever, run a group or been in a group, it's a big task to run that group, and it's a little bit dicey to try to sort of evaluate yourself in terms of, how you did, especially on, key content process, measures. So we felt like an observation approach would be much more reliable potentially and give us much richer information than a self-report approach. So that was number one. Then the question becomes, how do you do that, back in the day, we would have people, there'd be a camera on the wall, they would set it up and they would record the group, they would create a disc and they would send it through the mail, and that just was very cumbersome. So we did that for years and years. But the problem is timing there. You're getting information about 2 sessions ago by the time you have a chance to talk to the person. So that was just sort of the process that we went through to kind of get now we can, do this video recording that can be sent electronically. So at OSLC, observation has been one of the actual observation of parent-child interaction or of therapist-client interaction has been one of the sort of approaches I think that has characterized our center over time. When we first developed these parenting interventions, Jerry Patterson and John Reed, they went out to families' homes and watched and developed an observation system to watch the daily interaction between parents and kids, because you get much different information from that and much more sort of malleable information from that than you get asking a parent, what was your dinner time like yesterday, So you really can understand sort of the microsocial sequence of interaction and where you might tailor and make a change in that. And so, the observation idea, we just sort of brought that forward over time. So it was just then a practical matter of how we're going to be able to pull that off, And we've it's become a lot easier with advances in technology.
And so as you were implementing this intervention package in New York, can you talk a little bit about how long it took really to transition or repurpose?
Yeah, let me just answer the second part of Patrick's question, which I realized I forgot. Who pays for it? So
Small detail.
Yeah. We bundle in the fidelity. We always have the fidelity monitoring support as part of the intervention, the cost of the intervention. So the agency needs to have that laptop with the camera, and they pay for that. And the external mic. It's very minimal kind of equipment, but it needs to be there. And basically, it's very cheap to transmit that kind of information. We have a secure server. That's all very doable, and it doesn't add a huge cost to the intervention as it stands now. Now, we've spent a fair amount of money from the National Institutes of Health developing that capacity and developing those fidelity measures and so forth. So that's been paid for under grants with taxpayer dollars, But the actual implementation of it now, it's a relatively trivial cost. Okay, I'm sorry, Claire.
No, that's okay. I'm just thinking about as people are sitting in the audience and listening online and thinking, goodness, I really want to think about doing this. What's the time frame that you feel like it really took to repurpose the role of the caseworker, the foster parent, the kinship parent towards this approach?
So it takes about 3 months of partnership, collaboration, and planning between the agency that's going to be receiving and the developers, because again, we need to understand the culture that we're and the practice and the daily time use of the agency that we're going in, and we need to figure out how that's going to fit. Because as Fred has talked about, just adding without subtracting is not going to work. That's a good way to blow up your workforce, So that takes about 3 months to get all the logistics ready, to get the training to happen on the fidelity system and so forth. Then we have found that after running 3 groups, so each group is 16 weeks, after running 3 groups, on average, most people, 85% of people, meet fidelity standards and during those 3 groups, they could be run at the same time, but they're about 4 months. And so in most settings, it takes about a year for a caseworker to have run 3 of these 16-week sessions of PTC or KEEP. At that point, about 85% of those people or more are competent to run that intervention with fidelity, high fidelity, without weekly consultation. So at that point, we step down the consultation to a monthly consultation. Now, because we want to establish a way for the agency to build their own infrastructure to do this intervention themselves over time, the agency has the option of selecting from their certified or approved facilitators, trainers. And we do another week of training with those people. We shadow their first training to give them feedback, but then they can become the trainers in their own agency. And we just minimally monitor fidelity, sort of forever over time. To get the trained trainer in your agency takes about another year. It's 2 years. In 2 years, you can be sort of free of needing developer involvement. And the second year requires a lot less developer involvement than the first. So you have an intensive year, a much less intensive second year, and then you're kind of ready to go.
Great, thank you. We've got a question from our remote guests, and I'm going to start with Brian, as it is a bit of a policy question, and something that he and I both are quite familiar with, given the work at the Administration on Children, Youth, and Families. So the question really focuses on the Title IV waiver in child welfare. And the question really revolves around, is there any words of wisdom for those states that are operating in a waiver environment as it relates to implementing evidence-based interventions generally, and these interventions more specifically? Is there opportunity going forward, and including what the field has as a potential to learn as well as any pitfalls that we may experience as we're trying to implement many interventions at the same time?
Lots of parts to that question,
Yes,
so I will
yes.
try to answer it, and then you can remind me if I leave anything out. I think what's important about the question is that it really does set a timeline for child welfare's movement into this space of trying to integrate safety, permanency, and well-being, and doing that through a selected number of interventions and practice changes. The Title 4E waiver represents an effort by the federal government to give states greater flexibility in the use of the resources that the federal government provides to agencies across the country, to give them that flexibility on the prospects that they could produce better outcomes. So each state that is interested in a waiver has to make a proposal, and that proposal has to articulate how they expect to achieve positive outcomes for children and families over the life of the waiver. And once the federal government approves that, then states can go forward in the implementation of that work. So today there are probably 17 states that have authority under the new waiver statute that the Congress passed, and there are another 5 or so that are operating under old authority, but moving in a similar direction. So, depending on how you do the math, there's probably 20 to 25 states that are moving in this direction of trying to align their intervention approaches to a set of outcomes that they care about. So that said, I think that states are in very different places, and so I think that the question of how many interventions you can ramp up depends on your infrastructure. So that there are some states where there's been a tradition of delivering some of these complex interventions like MST, using Medicaid as the funder, and introducing them into systems. And if you happen to be one of those states, then you could obviously leverage the lessons learned there and the skills and competencies around this work and be able to be more aggressive in the number of interventions you might introduce. If you're in a state that doesn't have that kind of tradition, that you're starting at a relatively early stage of learning how to do this work, then I think being thoughtful about both the type of intervention that's being introduced as well as the number of interventions are important. So that's the basic answer to the question. I think at the end of the day, the challenge will be how does the system support the intervention and successful implementation? Because I think that's probably the biggest challenge in terms of capacity. So think about it this way. If you're a child welfare director and you're sitting in your office today preparing your budget for the work that you'll be doing next fiscal year, if you were going to buy a traditional mental health or counseling service, right, through that budget, you would simply allocate the amount of money that you want to spend for that service, right? And then you would just put that contract out on the street for bidding. And once those agencies that succeeded in the bid received the contract, you would assume that they'd just go out and do the work of delivering the service. You no longer have a responsibility for worrying about, did they get trained? Did they monitor fidelity? Did they work with a model developer? The assumption is you just put the money out on the street, you pick the right vendors, and they take off. End of story. If instead you're choosing to introduce an intervention that you don't have providers that know how to do this work, and you have to do the kind of ramping up 2-year period that Patty indicated, then that puts a whole level of new responsibilities on the administrative side, because you don't just push the contract out and then in a sense walk away. You actually have to be engaged in the process of scaling up capacity, and that is both inside the agency so that you can monitor and support it, as well as outside of the agency through the providers that will actually be building that capacity. So in the waiver or any circumstance under which you are introducing a new evidence-based intervention, it actually creates more of a demand on the administration side than if you stuck with a traditional purchase of an existing mental health service. So the challenges that Patty articulated are important. Fred's evaluation design pieces are important, but it's also important to think about the administrative capacity you need to introduce an evidence-based intervention and oversee its successful implementation, because it requires something different than what you're doing today as a system. And I think that's often the piece that gets left out in making these decisions about how many interventions to choose when you're pursuing a waiver.
Thank you. Let's see if we can't take another question from the floor here in the room. Yes, thank you.
Thank you. This is for Patty. You're talking about the foster parent and the child and that training. Where's the birth parent in all of that? Are they part of the foster parent meeting with the child, the training? How does that all work?
So the foster parents participate in a group with other foster parents, and the birth parents participate in a group with other birth parents. So, and I think that, you know, if, for example, the foster parent, let's say that the child is reunified before the foster parent completes keep. The idea would be that the foster parent can stay in the group, and they can either talk about another child who's placed in their home, or they can just be in the group and participate. There's no, you know, the reunification of the child should depend on, you know, how the child is doing and how the biological parent is doing. So we don't mix biological parents and foster parents in the same group. We have foster parents and kinship parents participate in KEEP. Biological, adoptive, relative, permanency, placement parents participate in the PTC. The information that those two groups of parents is receiving, these interventions, are very similar in terms of their theory, but the framing of the intervention is different for the foster parents and for the biological parents.
Thank you. I think we've got time for one or, oh, you're gonna, yeah, sure, follow up.
When do you bring the foster parent and the birth parent together for a particular child?
You know, as part, the caseworkers' daily routine or way of practicing is where that would happen. So it's not happening as a formalized part of this intervention. But the caseworker, you know, has routines where, for example, you know, the foster parent's bringing the child in for a visit with the parents, so that would be a natural point. And the caseworker, as part of the Parenting Through Change intervention, will be coaching that birth parent during the visit or before the visit, and in the skills that parent has learned in the Parenting Through Change groups. So we're not formally, as part of the groups, bringing foster parents and parents together, but we're recognizing and trying to capitalize on the times when, you know, that happens naturally in the casework routine.
Great. I think we have time for one, maybe two more questions. I'll ask a question.
Okay.
While you all think of one or two more. Fred, can you talk a little bit about any fiscal analysis that might have been part of the evaluation? And it may not have been, but you know, I'm just thinking about how, if I was an administrator, I would find the money to do this, or rather, if I was struggling to do that, make the case for why this was a good investment, given what the longer term return on my investment might be.
So that's a great question, and I think it's a relevant question whether you're doing waivers or not. The fundamental problem is, if I change this and I change length of stay, what is the return on investment? And then how does that, as I alluded to in my remarks about system effects, how does that then affect my balance sheet as an organization? we think it's a very important part of the choice of evidence-based interventions in terms of doing the actual fiscal analysis. What are your assumptions about the effect size on length of stay, and how much does that alter the revenue picture? And given the cost of implementation, can you get a return on investment? The practical problem of repurposing those dollars and the claiming that takes place in any given system, it's the advantage of the waiver that those problems, they don't go away, but the context in which those decisions are being made changes. And it's really an area where you need some cooperation with public authority in terms of repurposing dollars. But the whole issue of return on investment, it's going to cost me this much to do this, and can I reasonably expect to get a benefit equal to or better than that return on investment? And that's why the chart that I showed in my presentation in regards to the opportunity to save money in some contexts or repurpose dollars in some contexts for some organizations is very different than it is for others. When we negotiate the financial consequences of implementation of evidence-based interventions and other changes that people are interested in, the question always comes up, well, if I'm the overperformer, I'm in a very different position vis-a-vis these opportunities than the underperformers, and it feels sometimes like I'm being punished for getting the job done better. The problem is it's a reality. You cannot change the fact that there is a distribution. There are some that outperform, there are some that underperform, and the public responsibility is to try and figure out how to manage that in an equitable way. There are ways to share the risk and burden in ways that manages that problem. How much it manages it and with what level of satisfaction, of course, is always a question. But it gets, Claire, it gets to your point, is that implementing evidence-based interventions without careful due diligence around the finances is really perilous for a whole lot of reasons, and not the least of which is that you could wind up spending more money when you told people you would wind up spending less money, and that's not a good position to be in.
Patty, any costing data or analysis that you've done just from the developer or implementer perspective that you want to talk about?
We are not economists, and we don't know what we're doing in that realm. So, but we have had some economic analyses of the multidimensional treatment foster care done by the Washington State Institute on Public Policy, and they are economists. And they base their analysis on essentially crimes avoided and days, victim costs for crime, because multidimensional treatment foster care targets kids in the juvenile justice system, and it's an alternative to group home placement. And so I think those kind of analyses have been conducted by others and are show some favorable returns. But that it's sort of beyond the scope. We're relying on our partnership with Chapin Hall and with other people who are familiar with that field.
I think we've got time for one more quick question, and we've got somebody here who's not asked a question, so I'm going to get the microphone back to you. And we'll make this a quick answer, but I want to make sure that we get your question in.
Thank you. This is a question for Fred. I just want to ask, in welfare research, what do you perceive to be the major barriers for study, intervention process, implementation, and fidelity?
The major, I think it is the lack of a systems perspective. I think that, again, these are very complex systems. They adapt to the changes that you introduce. So at the end of the day, conceptualizing how those issues will be manifest in any given implementation, measuring them, and then using that to adjust how you understand whether or not the intervention worked the way you expected it to. That the advantage and the reason why they start in laboratories is because you control those external factors. When you put them into place, you unleash the external factors, and understanding, first anticipating them, and then from an implementation perspective, devising strategies that will blunt those forces from playing themselves out. And then from an evaluation strategy, capturing all of that in data and analysis, I think is the fundamental challenge.
Thank you. Got about 5 minutes left. Brian, I'm going to ask you to do closing remarks for the panel and to thank our guests for joining us.
Thanks, Claire. I think a couple of points that are worth making. The first one is how important this kind of conversation is, and how early we are in the process of having this conversation. Right, the child welfare system, I think, in many instances, have embraced the need to go beyond safety and permanency, and in many instances, child welfare directors and folks that are doing work in child welfare have been waiting for permission to go do this other part of what they signed up for when they entered the field of child welfare. And so this is a really important stage of development in child welfare for introducing these interventions in ways that really do try to integrate safety, permanency, and well-being. So we're going to learn a lot. We're going to stumble a lot. We're going to do some things well and some things not so well. And all of that comes with introducing any change in systems as complex as child welfare systems. So the value of the evaluation that we're doing in New York is not so that we can necessarily stand up and say KEEP is the greatest thing since sliced bread, but instead being able to evaluate the impact of KEEP so that the field benefits from learning how you do this work, what aspects of it work or don't work, and what we can expect to get in return, including what it costs, right? So I think that this conversation ought to be taken in the context of being very early in the developmental process of moving in this direction. I often say that the focus on permanency really emerged out of the Adoptions and Safe Families Act, which was a federal legislation that was passed in 1997. It really did place a critical focus on moving children through and out of the system. It created a focus on balancing the rights of parents to have their children returned to them and the rights of children to have permanent relationships. And that act, starting in 97, really does represent the overall change in the size of the foster care system. But the point I'd make here is that when they passed that law in 97 and the things that we started to do to get to better permanency outcomes for children, the things that we started to do in 1997 are different than the things that we're actually doing today to get children to permanency. So said differently, we didn't know all of the things that we'd be doing today to move children to permanency in 1997. We started down that path. We had some successes and failure, but the field learned from those experiences, and they built momentum over time, so that you today have some states that have reduced their child welfare population by 40, 50, 60%, and they've done it based on learning over time and refining the strategies that they've used to get there. I think on the issues of integrating policy focuses that focus on safety, permanency, and well-being together, we're at the early stages. We're going to learn a ton from KEEP and other initiatives across the country. But remember, we're at the beginning of a 10 or 15-year process, not the end of one. And so we're going to do as much well as we may do poorly, but over time, the field will get better at doing this. And they'll get better at doing it by being open to really rigorous but purposefully designed evaluations so that we make the progress over time. So I think that this is really important work, but it's really in its infancy in child welfare. And what we do over the next 15 years, I think, will significantly advance the cause and change fundamentally the work that we do in child welfare, and to change the way in which we organize the work in child welfare. So it's really exciting conversation to be had. Just a reminder that we're at the early stages. For all of you that are watching from the sidelines, states that aren't trying to figure out how to do this work, you need to jump in too, right? If you're an agency that's trying to figure out whether this is important work, you ought to jump in too. Not because there's certainty that you will get it right, but instead the certainty is that the only way to get it right is to get into the game and figure out over time how to do the work better, how to use CQI and other methods of getting better over time. So early stages, I think everybody ought to play. There's no penalty for playing here. There's no penalty for playing in the waiver situation. So I think it's a unique opportunity. The more that people get in, and the earlier they get in, the faster the field's going to move. So that's point one. And point two, which I'll make a lot more quickly.
Thank you. As our time is up.
Is the presentation that Patty did and the questions that were raised today really provide a really important reminder of the role that nonprofit private organizations play in the child welfare system. Children are going to get access to these interventions most likely through training and repurposing staff capacity in nonprofit organizations that have contracts with state child welfare agencies. So it's really the public sector in partnership with the private sector, the nonprofit sector, that's ultimately going to realize the benefits of these kind of interventions integrated into systems with the purpose of scaling them up. So as folks think about the integration of safety, permanency, and well-being, don't lose track of the fact that the private sector has to move with the public sector if we're going to get the kind of scale that we need to produce the kind of public health level outcomes that we want to have across the country. So when we talk about getting in the game, we're not just talking about the public sector getting in the game, we're also talking about the commitments of the leadership at the private agency level to also be in this game, because I think together we produce these outcomes, and separately we probably work at cross purposes. So it's an exciting time for everybody in child welfare, and we ought to think about everybody as we think about getting better outcomes for kids who are involved in the foster care system and better outcomes for the families that are involved in the foster care system. So thanks.
Thank you so much, Brian, and we very much appreciate that thrilling invitation to think about doing this work a bit differently. And I want to thank all of you for being here in the room and for those who have joined us remotely in the conversation, and we look forward to continuing this conversation going forward. Thank you.